ventilateur. Zo is er dus een dans ontstaan dankzij Helmond. En nu, Stephen Cave. Zeg ouderdom en we denken aan zorg. Onbetaalbare zorg en aan Alzheimer en euthanasie, aan lange zomers waarin onze grootmoeder willen vermoorden. Maar voor de Britse filosoof Stephen Cave is denken over ouderdom het in kaart brengen van het verlangen naar onsterfelijkheid. De dood uitstellen heeft in belangrijke mate onze cultuur bepaald. Hij schreef daar een belangwekkend boek over, Immortality, The Quest to Live Forever and How It Drives Civilization. Hoe kunnen we de dood verslaan? Nou, door in de eerste plaats gewoon er enorm op los te neuken. Want hoe meer nageslacht, hoe langer je zichtbaar blijft. En daar zijn voorbeelden van. Een andere manier is natuurlijk je onsterfelijk maken door heel veel mensen dood te maken. Zodat je een hele slechte naam krijgt die nog een lange echo heeft. Of eeuwige roem, iets geweldigs te maken. En dan kun je ook in wederopstanding geloven. Dat is ook een wijdverbreid optimisme. En je kunt de mens als machine zien. Gaat er iets kapot, dan vervang je het of je laat iets groeien op een muis en je plaatst het erin. Misschien eindigen we wel als computer. Dat is ook een vorm van immortality. In 2012 werd Stephen Cave's Immortality The New Scientist uitgeroepen tot the best book of the year. Na zijn doktersgraad in metaphysics in Cambridge werkte hij als diplomaat. Uiteindelijk is hij gaan leven van denken en schrijven en woont met een Duitse vrouw in Berlijn. Hij publiceert in de Financial Times, maar heeft ook een rubriek op Deutschland Radio Kultur. Well, the American writer Dorothy Parker wrote a famous line, Mr. Cave. The more you think of dying, the better you will live. But will we live better when we never die? Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Adrienne. I think I've actually no idea what you just said. I hope it was nice, apart from the last line. That was very sensible. There you go. Ladies and gentlemen, as our understanding of ourselves deepens, we are learning ever more ways in which we systematically make mistakes. Ways in which we predictably misjudge or miscalculate, distort reality, or see what we want to see. Now, psychologists call these biases, cognitive biases. And there are many different kinds, some trivial, some serious, some big, some small, some common, some rare. And the idea is that by understanding these biases, we can come to avoid them, or at least we can try to minimize the impact they have on our lives, the extent to which they make us get things wrong. Know thyself, as the oracle at Delphi said. Well, what I want to present to you today is the biggest bias of all. It is a bias that has shaped civilizations, molded history, and is probably steering the lives of many of you here today. Now, as I say, biases come in different forms, and the one I want to talk about is a way in which we believe what we want to believe. Psychologists call this motivated reasoning, because our reasoning is not cold and logical, but is motivated by our deep desire, by what we want to be true. Psychologists call this motivated reasoning, the rest of us call it wishful thinking. And it's a very particular kind of wish that I want to talk about. So what is this wish that we so desperately want fulfilled that it distorts our image of reality? That every human in history, as far back as we can tell, has so desperately wanted to have fulfilled? Well, simple. It is the wish not to die. And the bias works like this. We so desperately want not to die that we will believe anything that tells us we're not going to. We will believe any story that says we don't have to die but can live forever. Now, today I want to present two kinds of evidence for this bias. The first one comes from the laboratory, over 400 studies from the field of social psychology. The other one comes from history, and it is the way in which these stories recur again and again through time in different cultures. So first, the experiments. As I say, over 400 experiments conducted over the last 2 decades, initially in America, then throughout the world. They are ingenious and yet actually very simple, and they all work like this. You take 2 groups of people, essentially very similar, and you remind one of those groups that they're going to die, and not the other. The other is your control group. And then you assess their behavior and their attitudes and their values. And so that way you can measure what kind of a bias emerges when people are reminded about death, when they think about death. And in every case, what you find is that people who are reminded of death are then biased to believe stories, regardless of the evidence, that promise they don't die, but can in fact live forever. So here's an example. One recent study took 2 groups of agnostics, that is, people who were undecided in their religious belief. And these people were equally undecided, at least they were before the study. Now, one of these groups of agnostics was asked to think about being dead. The other group was asked to think about being lonely. Then they were again asked about their beliefs. The group who had been asked to think about death were twice as likely then to express faith in God and Jesus. Twice as likely, even though beforehand they had been equally agnostic. Get them thinking about death, they run to Jesus. And this effect also works for people who are already religious. If you remind them of their mortality, they will become, by every measure, more religious. So getting people to think about death biases them to believe, regardless of the evidence, a story that promises them the afterlife. So if any of you here are thinking of founding your own religion, my advice, promise an afterlife and get people to think about death. So you could, for example, have as the symbol of your religion someone dying, someone being crucified, perhaps. Okay, that one's been done. But you get the picture. A different kind of experiment, another example. Many thinkers have believed that nationalism or tribalism are also stories that help us to defy death, because they promise we can live on as part of a greater whole, as part of the nation or the tribe, for example. It's no coincidence that currently the German extreme nationalist movement is recruiting with the slogan "Werde unsterblich," become immortal, as part of the eternal German folk. And this has always been part of the narrative of nationalism. Well, the researchers decided to test this, and they tested it in Italy. And Italians who were reminded about their death were significantly more likely to identify themselves as Italian, to see Italians as a coherent, permanent group, and to be mean about people who weren't Italian. So once again, what we find is that reminding people of something they ought already to know, that they are mortal, is having a profound effect on an attitude so fundamental as national identity. Religion and nationalism have both had a huge influence on the history of humanity and still do today. And yet here we have evidence that they are, at least in part, products of a simple bias. A bias that works like this. Remind people of death. We are afraid of death, so we believe any story that tells us we don't have to die. Now, the theory behind these studies is called terror management theory. It was inspired by the work of an American anthropologist called Ernest Becker. It's called terror management theory because the idea is we develop world views, that is, stories we tell ourselves about the world and our place in it, in order to manage the terror of death. And humans have been doing this since they became cognitively sophisticated enough, however many hundreds of thousands of years ago, to realize they were going to die. Which brings me to the second set of evidence, which is the stories themselves. Now, I'm going to call these immortality stories, because immortality is what they promise. They promise that we can live forever. And these stories are central not only to religion and to nationalism, but to every other kind of philosophy, art, architecture, even economics. They have thousands of different manifestations. Yet behind the enormous diversity of different stories, there are actually just 4 basic forms this story can take. And these 4 basic forms of the immortality story can be seen recurring again and again throughout history. Now, I'm going to briefly introduce these 4 fundamental immortality stories, and I want to try to give you in this short time some sense of how they are retold by each generation and culture using the vocabulary of their day. So the first kind of story is the most straightforward. We don't want to die, we want to stay alive. Well, the dream of staying alive in this body physically forever is the first immortality story. I'm going to call it the elixir story. Because even though it sounds implausible to think we can keep going in this body, actually every culture in human history has some legend of an elixir of life or a fountain of youth that promises we can keep going in this body forever. We can find these stories in ancient Greece, in ancient Babylon, in ancient India. Ancient Chinese were obsessed with the quest for an elixir of life. We see it throughout European history with the alchemists. And we so much want to believe this story that we still tell it to ourselves today. And we use, of course, the vocabulary of science. 100 years ago, when hormones had just been discovered, you could read about how hormone therapy was going to cure aging and disease, maybe death itself. Today, you can read about how stem cells and genetic engineering and nanotechnology are going to cure death for us. But the idea that science can cure aging and even death is just one more chapter in this very long history of the elixir story. So that's the first story. But of course, some people are skeptical of the idea that we can keep this body going forever. After all, when we look back through history, the one thing that all those who claim to have found the elixir of life now have in common is that they're all dead. So it's a good idea to have a backup plan. And exactly this backup plan is what the second story promises, the resurrection story. It stays with the idea that you and I are just these physical bodies, acknowledges that we have to die, but says you can rise again and so live again. It says you can do what Jesus did. Jesus died, 3 days in the tomb, then he physically rose again, went to his disciples. And the idea of physical resurrection is still fundamental to Christianity and is also dogma for Orthodox Judaism and Islam. But even for those who don't believe, we are telling this story to ourselves, but updated for the scientific age. You might have heard of cryonics. This is the idea that when we die, we can have ourselves frozen, and then in the future, when technology is sophisticated enough, we can have ourselves thawed out and revived and rejuvenated, and so we can live again. So some people believe an omnipotent God will raise them up to live again on the day of judgment. Some people believe omnipotent future scientists will raise them up, will resurrect them to live again. But it's the same story. But some people find any version of the resurrection story just too much like a bad zombie film. They find the idea of the physical body just far too unreliable to guarantee immortality. And so these people prefer the third, more spiritual story, the soul story. The idea that we have a soul that is immaterial and eternal and will live on when the body dies. Now, the majority of people on earth believe they have such a soul, and this story is fundamental to most religions. Yet even though the story in its traditional form remains extremely popular, we are still retelling this story too, in the language of our time. So, for example, you can read that soon we will be able to upload I'll be able to upload my mind, the real me, my essence, onto a computer. And then I'll be able to live on as an avatar in the digital ether. Still, some people are skeptical about any kind of soul, and the evidence of science, in particular neuroscience, suggests that the real you is actually dependent upon your body and your brain and dies with it. And so some people turn instead to the fourth fundamental kind of immortality story, the legacy story. The story that says that you can live on through the echo you leave behind you in the world. Like the great Greek hero Achilles, for example, who fought and died at Troy, but won eternal fame. And here we are talking about him still today. And this quest for eternal fame is, of course, today just as popular as it ever was. And indeed, in our digital age, it is even easier to become famous. You don't have to be a great hero or warrior or king. All you need is an internet connection and an amusing cat. But some people leave behind a more tangible, biological legacy. Children, for example, or living on as part of their tribe or their nation. And although this story has also always been popular throughout history, it has received a boost in modern times through the idea of the gene, and the idea that our genes are immortal and go back to our distant ancestors and carry on in our children or our kinsfolk. So those are the four kinds of immortality story. Of course, some people are skeptical also of the legacy story. They think, well, okay, we talk about Achilles, but that doesn't mean he's really still alive. Woody Allen, for example, said, I don't want to live on in the hearts of my countrymen. I want to live on in my apartment. Well, if you want to live on in your apartment, then of course you believe in the first story, the one about staying alive through an elixir. And so the circle is complete. Those are the 4 kinds of immortality story, and you can find them in any culture, any religion, any civilization, repeating again and again. And the fact that they repeat in this way ought to give us pause for thought. The very fact that, for example, the Chinese believed they were going to find an elixir through herbs and qigong, and the fact that we believe we're going to do it with stem cells and nanotechnology, for example, suggests that it's not on the basis of the evidence that we have these beliefs. It's not on the strength of the evidence that we believe that either God or an omnipotent scientist are going to raise us up on the last day. It's not because of the strength of the logic that we believe in an immortal soul or that we're going to be uploaded onto computers and live on as avatars. No. We believe these things because the bias to believe them is so strong. We believe them because we want to believe them. And we want to believe them because we're afraid of death. Now, I think this fear of death is natural, in the sense that it naturally arises from the human condition. We, like all living things, want to live, want to survive, want to project ourselves into the future. But unlike other living things, we are aware that this will to live will one day be thwarted. We are aware that we must die. The worst thing that can possibly happen one day will. We must live in that knowledge, and that is not easy. But because this fear is natural, does not mean it's good for us. Of course, these stories that we tell ourselves to allay this fear, they can be comforting, they can even be inspiring. But they can also be hugely destructive when they lead to prejudice and nationalism, to holy wars and suicide bombing, or just when they lead people to waste their lives believing they have eternity when in fact they just have a few decades. So, overall, it seems to me a shame that we should lead the one life we have in a way that is steered by denial and fear. So the question is, can we overcome this bias? Well, the thought I want to leave you with is this. The fear of death is natural, but it is not rational. And it is not rational because death is never something we can experience. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein put it like this: death is not an event in life. We do not live to experience death. As living things, yes, we want to live, but as living things, we can never literally be dead. We can never experience death. Birth and death are, if you like, the limits where our experience fades out. They are the horizons of our awareness. And we should not be steered in this life by fear of what is beyond those horizons. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen Cave. Dames en heren, coffee break, koffiepauze. Een half uurtje.